So, welcome back to the Cracks in Postmodernity. Today we have Jack, the Perfume Nationalist, joining us. So, thanks for coming, Jack.
It's a pleasure. Thanks for having me.
So, for those who don't already know about Perfume Nationalist, tell us a little bit of background. Like, how did you get started? What's the inspiration behind it, and all of that?
I started Perfume Nationalist with my brother in February 2019. So we've been doing it 3 years now. Basically, I was working dead end service jobs, hospitality jobs, and was a kind of failed academic, made it halfway through a master's program in English, and then got discouraged. And I had also started a job as a copy editor of women's ebook erotica at
Okay.
that time, which my first full-time job, which took up all of my time. So for a long time, there was no creative outlet. I loved school. I loved being assigned books to formulate ideas and essays about and meet together to talk about them. Um, and I also had a parallel interest in perfume going back to probably 2007, 2008,
Mhm.
and kind of amassed all of this knowledge about the history of perfume, started buying and wearing women's perfumes from the 80s and stuff indiscriminately. I mainly just wanted some kind of outlet, and my brother suggested we should just try recording a podcast, and we kept doing it, and here we are. But the main gist of it is uh, pairing relevant perfumes with different media throughout history, whether that's it's predominantly movies, but also literature, TV shows, soap opera, sometimes video games and albums. Um, and yeah, that's it.
Yeah, so I also had a perfume phase when I was like in middle school. I don't really know why I was so fascinated by it, but I would always go to the department stores and I would ask for the little samples and I would like try to go over and over again to the point that they recognized me and would stop giving me them. But I had like a whole,
What samples did you like?
I just took whatever I could get. I would just ask them for samples and then I had like a big box of all of that.
Right. I remember being in like elementary school
Yeah.
and making one of those little tube samples last for like months, like
Yeah.
some cologne from Eddie Bauer or like Abercrombie, a mall
Yeah.
store. Just put a tiny, delicate dab. Now I spray lavishly and can't possibly use up everything that I have during my
Yeah.
lifetime. So
Yeah, I'm too cheap to buy actual bottles. I just collect the samples and like use them sparingly. Also, because I get headaches very easily. Like I remember once I got the Justin Bieber one and it like gave me diarrhea. It was really bad.
oh, I imagine that's really bad. I mean, yeah, the really cheap bottom of the shelf kind of mop water
Yeah.
stuff is more likely to do that. Sometimes it just smells like hot plastic.
Yes.
But as Luca Turin said, the only appeal of cheap perfumes is that they smell good. So there's something like we cover things in the entire range of cost and availability, from like $10 drugstore perfumes to, $400 and up, niche stuff.
Have you ever gone to like one of those bootleg vendors who mix them with water but market them as like, the real designer ones?
Yeah, there's a certain charm to that. I recall going in this like a combination like head shop, Bob Marley memorabilia and knockoff perfume store in New
Yeah.
Orleans, downtown, and the walls are just covered in bottles with like handwritten labels that say
Yep.
different designer perfumes. And I would imagine they all smell pretty bad. But yeah, the fakes can be kind of archaeologically interesting, and some of
Mhm.
them are really good and kind of preserve the spirit of an old perfume better than the real thing does through decades of reformulation. Like there's one called Cafe that's a dupe of opium that costs like
Okay.
$8 that's remained unchanged since 1978, and it's a really good dupe of opium. But generally, you got to get the real thing for the
Yeah.
real experience. And perfume is an affordable luxury. It was always intended as an affordable luxury. Like
Mm.
designer perfumes were explicitly intended as something that the common man could afford when they could not afford a $10,000 custom couture garment.
Yeah.
Just some attainable representation of these luxury brands.
Yeah. No, whenever I go down like in Chinatown in Manhattan, they have all those vendors with the cheap ones. And like once I was with a friend who was not from New York and she saw they had like some Armani perfume for like $20. And she's like, oh my God, I have to get some of these for my mom. And I was like, no, it's watered down. Like that's why it's so cheap. But they swear that it's the real thing, of course, but
Yeah, you can go wrong easily with
very
that. But there's also like everything on Amazon and like FragranceNet and stuff like that is real, but there are all these unhinged reviews from like boomers who have lost their sense of smell and don't believe in online shopping or trust it. They're like, I was sent a fake, as though there's this factory making like lavish totally detailed and correct replicas of like Clinique aromatics elixir bottles and selling them for $30 on Amazon. Like, no, that's not true. But yeah, if it's some desirable like current designer thing that's like mentioned in rap songs, then that what you see on eBay for a mysteriously low price will be fake.
yeah. So then what are your top perfumes? Which ones do you like the most? If you can.
um yeah, my top perfumes, the most influential ones on me, the original Comme des Garçons Eau de Parfum from 1994, which smells like a deconstructed spice cabinet, and came packaged in like a shrink wrapped, vacuum sealed kind of plastic, and looked like just garbage. It's amazing. That's one of my favorites. Clinique Aromatics Elixir, which was an early
Talk about
experiment in kind of rich hippie aromatherapy, from 1971 or 72,
was that your first
promoted
episode?
by,
That one?
yeah, Problematics Elixir. It was the
I
first
remember that.
episode,
Yeah.
and it was promoted kind of as a drug or a psychedelic trip, and in this holistic manner, not like the other perfumes. And it was designed for Estee Lauder's fragrance-free hypoallergenic Swedish spin-off brand Clinique, and it's this strong, like forest floor, green chypre, heavy patchouli, totally 70s. Yeah, Angel, Estee Lauder Youth Dew,
Mhm.
which is from 53, which is a massive oriental spice fragrance, that was marketed to women to buy for themselves for the first time as a bath oil. And it smells like ancient Egypt and like the best kind of mummy sarcophagus you could ever imagine. Very like Joan Crawford, old Hollywood, 50s kind of deal, still exactly the same as it always was. And then Claude Montana's Parfum de Peau, which is one from a Rose Chypre from the 80s that comes in this big, striking helix, like DNA helix bottle. And Montana was, along with Terry Mugler, one of the designers that brought in shoulder pads, and he had these like fascistic looking, kind of Nazi looking runway shows, all heavy leather, very like SS uniform, cool aesthetics, but a very garbagey, strange fragrance genre. One of my favorites.
Mhm. The only ones that I wear once in a while, so Victor and Rolf's Spice Bomb. Do you know that one?
Yeah, I know that one.
What do you think of it?
Um, it's okay. What I prefer, okay, that genre of like cinnamon spice sort of masculines. I think the
Mhm.
best one of those that ever was is Chanel Egoiste, the original Egoiste, not Platinum Egoiste. Um, so anytime I smell something that's like a descendant of Egoist, I'm like, you should get Egoist instead. But yeah, that one's it was nice. It's very popular with men and women alike.
Yeah. Because of the flower bomb, the women's one. I mean, similar. The men's is like I don't know how to describe it. I don't know the technical terms, but like people always think it's when they smell it that it's like apple cider. That's what they usually say.
Yeah, it does have a cozy, Christmassy apple
Yeah.
cider vibe. I like anything with that kind of ceremonial holiday Christmas vibe. The original Comme des Garçons is much like that. I like the spice cabinet quality that people often call Yankee Candle.
Yeah.
The smell of Christmas.
Yeah. So I have that one and then the YSL Loam. Home. However you
Hmm.
say it. That one's like cheapier kind of smelling, much lighter kind of it's not as pungent, I guess.
Yeah, the fall of the House of YSL is really a tragedy. L'Oreal bought their beauty division
Oh,
in I
really?
think 2009, and
Okay.
they had this decades long history of producing the most amazingly production designed uh striking fragrances ever, like Opium,
Mhm.
Kouros, Rive Gauche, Paris. And then for the last 10 12 years they've kind of discontinued all the old ones, and are putting like these ads out with like Lenny Kravitz for these, kind of
Yeah.
pretty crowd pleasing mainstream fragrances. Nothing like an Opium or a Kouros.
Yeah. Yeah, my grandmother used to use the opium one. It's a very distinct smell. Yeah, that one. And then the I have Blue de Chanel, which is like a little too strong for me. Only like a couple times a year will I wear it. It's like a very masculine fragrance.
Yeah, that one's huge. I always direct people to that one if they want like one of the popular mainstream kind of blue current men's department store fragrances. It's
Yeah.
much better than uh Dior's Sauvage and like all these other kind of imitations of it.
Yeah. So I'm wondering, like, how do you pair these fragrances with whatever kind of pop culture medium when you're planning your episodes?
In lots of different ways. Sometimes they're very obliquely related, and
Mhm.
it works less well than other times. But I consider the time period that it represents, because fragrances and the sense of smell is a psychedelic time warp.
Mhm.
And that's what interested me initially when I started smelling like Giorgio and all these 80s fragrances. I was like, oh, I can be transported instantly to another era that has nothing to do with right now. Suddenly I'm in like Mae West's drawing room. And I consider the time period, I consider the mood and genre of the fragrance, whether this is like lush, heavy lidded, oriental type druggy deal like Opium, or if it's a sharp green Chypre. I consider the advertising imagery and the image that they created for the perfume.
Mhm.
Um, Sometimes it's just the fact that the perfume is like featured in the movie prominently or whatever, but mainly I would say more often than not it's about the time period and just the general vibe.
Yeah. No, I always find that I don't know, the way that you're able to connect them, it's interesting because like I always was just, had a kind of fleeting interest in perfume, but to see how you can like read into it, all the fragrance notes, but also the kind of cultural implication. Um, but what I think what first drew me, I think I found you through the Anna and Dasha episodes, which were like what was it 2 years ago at this
It
point?
was 2 years ago, I think.
Yeah.
Or it was summer and fall 2020.
Okay. Yeah. It's almost 2 years. But then I think like what also drew me is, the many Paglia references. So I'm just curious, like how did you first find Paglia? When did it all begin for you?
I first found Palia through the audio commentary she did on the Basic Instinct special edition DVD that was put out in I think 2002 or 2003. And I listened to that and I was like, who is this woman? She's fascinating.
Yeah.
And when I was going to Austin Community College, I was 18 or 19. I checked Sexual Personae out of the library, and read a few pages and immediately went and bought all the other books. And at that time, they were everywhere in the social sciences section of every half price. There was a full set of Paglia. I never see this anymore, which is a good sign because I think people keep them now.
Yeah.
But I read, before reading the entirety of Sexual Personae, I read Vamps and Tramps and Sex, Art, and American Culture, the essays collections. And for the first time, I felt represented, like my um, swampy viewpoint that had been brewing in my head, where I had been very openly gay in high school from a very young age. So I was sort of automatically sequestered in with the precocious millennial liberals who at that time liked stuff like The Daily Show. And I sensed that there was something that did not resonate with me about their viewpoint. I felt like I really don't belong with whatever this kind of sanctimonious thing is,
Yeah.
but I'd never seen it fully extrapolated until I read Paglia, and she provides uh, an intricately mapped out, exceedingly funny and shocking view of the world that and of art that completely resonated with me. And my fervor for Paglia was kind of cringe in the early days. I even like bought complete sets of Paglia for like everyone in the family one Christmas. Such was my passion. Um, but yeah, she just became the dominant theorist of my life. And as I went through college and read a bunch of other more encouraged and respected theorists, they all seemed really dry and mediocre, and it's just
Mhm.
frankly not as good. So it's good that I read Paglia prior to higher level college courses, because that really like gave me the guideposts to deal with academia.
Yeah, I always wish I found her before college because what I was reading, look, like I went to a Jesuit college, and I majored in theology and then ended up doing a master's after in theology. But they had us reading Judith Butler and Foucault. And I mean, that was basically it, like all the post-structuralists. And I didn't really have a way to make sense of what they were presenting. First of all, because it's incomprehensible and boring. But
And it's
uh,
designed to be
yeah,
incomprehensible because you have to pay and feed into the ladder of academia and get deeper and deeper into the system, like a religion like Scientology, in order for these supposedly so complex ideas to be revealed to you. You then have the authority, the divine right, like you're the pope or a priest or something reading the Bible in Latin. You're allowed to read these things.
yeah. No, so then I don't think I found her until probably right after I finished undergrad. I was roaming around some like subversive quote unquote bookstore in the West Village in New York, and they had her amongst all the feminist books. And when I saw it, I was like, oh, like one of these kind of like dumb basic feminists. But then I looked her up and I was like, sounds a little bit different. She's kind of old. I don't really know. But it wasn't until I found there was some YouTube video where she talked about transgenderism. And, you
That
know,
was after she declared herself transgender, when the transgender stuff
yeah,
started. Yeah, so she could criticize it.
yes, a true transgender. So when I saw that, I was like, oh, wait, maybe she's not like all these other feminists. And then I found a copy of Sexual Personae lying around in at a bookstore. I decided to pick it up and I was like totally enthralled. But I think like for me, what really drew me is that. So like, I decided to major in theology because I converted to Catholicism in undergrad. And the school where I did my master's was a little bit more, I guess, had more integrity in terms of like the Catholic background. And I was reading, a lot of the recent theology on sexual morality, especially John Paul II, which to me like was really coherent. It made sense. But my big question is like, okay, but what does this have to say to a culture that's kind of going in such the opposite direction? I didn't really see any way to bridge what I was reading and what I ultimately agreed with what's happening in the culture. And reading her, like, look, she's a lapsed Italian Catholic. She identifies as a pagan, animist, atheist, whatever. But what I recognize is this understanding of the fact that human sexuality is situated in this tension between um, these dark forces and these ideals. So ultimately, the Dionysian and the Apollonian, which for me, it's like, sure, in Catholicism, there are certain ideals of, what constitutes sanctity, holiness. But then there's this pull towards, that kind of dark side, which comes from original sin. And even though she thinks, yes, like, okay, we should transgress the boundaries of nature and that, blah, 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 the fact that she recognizes there is this darkness, that there is a tension, like this resonated very much with me in a way that I don't know. Like I know some Catholics who do read her, but like some who are kind of scandalized. But I think there's like she can't shake off that pagan Catholic sensibility, that sense of the tension between sin and these higher ideals. And again, like you said, she does it in a way that's entertaining, that's funny, but extremely intelligent and sharp, you know.
Right. And um as you said, she recognizes the value of all sides. Like everything, like sexuality is this push pull apparatus with consequences. And the fact that she sees all of this is what disturbs people so much, because the simple fact of it is that unbridled libertine sexuality has consequences. And especially at the time in 1990, when sexual personae came out, all of the dialogue around AIDS was this preview of the kind of liberalism we see, liberal activism we see today, with this just kind of utopian evasion of responsibility, where clearly the total sexual liberation of gay men, unprecedented to that point, and straight people too, with divorce and just everything after the
Yeah.
60s, had resulted in this deadly disease sweeping the nation. And that's a fact of how it's transmitted.
Yeah.
But the gay activists, the way that they chose to waste everyone's resources and time was to, depict things like Ryan White and like saintly straight people are just as likely to end up with AIDS, and that's how you become sympathetic to this thing. And that resulted in just bad information. Like people then do not know how to actually avoid getting HIV because of this utopian diversity masking of the realities of it and who gets it. But yeah, she depicts all sides. She is an atheist, but she understands the value of religion. um I think her assertive and uh didactic tone without excessive mealy mouth qualifications really turns off academics and people who have gone through the whole system, because you're very trained by modern liberalism to preface everything that you say with, well, this doesn't stand for all cases and everyone, when that should be self-evident. But that didactic style of speaking is why she's so powerful.
Yeah, and it's exactly that. Like she shows all sides because she is intent on not denying reality, which is ultimately what I think the post-structuralist and even the Enlightenment project is trying to do. Like she acknowledges that there's such a thing as nature, and that whether you think we should transgress the boundaries of nature or we should conform to it, that's another story, but it's a real thing. So like whether you think we should, have abortion and not gay marriage, but like that homosexuality should be celebrated, okay, but this is not a neutral phenomenon. Like there, as you said, there are consequences. And I think like, when you look at the very beginning of sexual persona, she draws up this dichotomy between these Enlightenment thinkers of this, I guess, this myth of neutrality, like Locke and Rousseau, versus these early libertines like de Sade, like Nietzsche. Because yeah, like when you look at de Sade, he's saying like, yeah, like let's totally go against the boundaries of nature. But let's recognize that this is something perverse. Like this is not just like, oh, I'm expressing my feelings and being myself.
Hmm.
Um, but yeah, so I'm curious to hear more what you think about de Sade and what she says about him and what that has to do with our cultural moment at this point.
Well, I read 120 Days of Sodom in ninth grade
Oh wow.
over 2 nights, and that irrevocably influenced my psyche and everything that came thereafter. I would read passages of it out loud to my goth friends during science class, and I had found out about Sade from Salo, as
Yeah.
everyone does, but especially at that time, uh, as a DVD collector at peak DVD, um, the Salo Criterion DVD, the original, was like the rarest DVD that no one had. It was like $500. Um, and at that time, when I got into art cinema and kind of transgressive literature, I was just looking for the most shocking things imaginable. It all stemmed from this Premiere magazine list of like the most shocking movies that I found in seventh grade, or the most extreme movies that basically informed me of the existence of like everything that I'm into now. And I have always had an interest in uh, massive works that uh, seem almost impossible to experience in full. This stems from my interest in soap operas, which daytime soap operas played 5 days a week, every day, an hour a day, with a continuing plot line that sometimes, as in the case of Guiding Light, started on radio in the 30s. So this is like almost a century of slow, repetitive plot going on. And this is what a lot of people dislike about Sade. You'll hear the common refrain, as you do with basically every author that I like, Ayn Rand included, that he's a bad writer, that he's repetitive and didactic and all of this. But I absolutely love his writing style, and I love that Justine and Juliet are linked together as this massive operatic mission statement of depravity and evil. I think it's the best literary representation of total subversion. Yeah, this is part of a big part of my entire polemic about what I call productive boredom.
Mhm.
I think that people are currently trained to think of being bored by media as a bad thing always, and I
Mhm.
feel that um, a certain level of boredom is and repetitiveness is like facilitates something entering your brain and your psyche in a different way than something like fast paced and exciting and well plotted, like the whiz bang Martin Scorsese movie or whatever it does.
Mhm.
But critics generally tend to see that stuff as a flaw, and this is why people hate Sade. Like, you never encounter anyone that likes Sade.
Yeah.
um they'll kind of go around and they'll watch Cello, and then they'll dip into it maybe a little in a class, and they'll see, oh, this is just awful, and then they see all the critical stuff about how confirming this, oh yes, Sod is so terrible, but they don't actually read the books.
No.
um I just instantly loved the books, and I, as a representation of total evil beyond imagination, especially so early on in the invention of the novel as an art form, it seems just unimaginable that that an art object like this exists. Yeah, people all hate it. They don't give them the time of day. That contemporary review of Sexual Persona you sent me,
Yeah.
um, claims that Sod was very trendy at the time, and that might be so in academic circles, but I've seen the same opinions of Sod parroted everywhere for the last 20 years, you know.
Yeah, I've never seen him in any academic setting, not even mentioned, let
Mm.
alone be on a syllabus. And I mean, I think that is a shame because, I mean, ultimately, as Paglia says, modern liberalism and then in turn post-structuralism is an intent on pushing this myth of neutrality, that sexuality is just this expression of identity, the self, blah, blah, blah. But it's not, there isn't this recognition that there are these external forces beyond just my feelings or my personal self expression that are not neutral. Like they're situated between darkness, evil, destructiveness, and these higher ideals, beauty, sacrifice. Um, and I don't know, like that totally goes against everything that we're being told. But then if we're realists, if we look at reality, we can't deny that part of our sexual desires, any of our desires, can be very destructive. And I think this is what's genius about the Sadis. Like, let's go all the way and look at just how dark our humanity can be. Like, it's not all sunshine and rainbows, as Rousseau would naively like to say so. But again, like that
Right.
can't be said today. We're not allowed to
And
think.
I think that the liberals also find Sade so off-putting because he says the quiet part out loud about their whole antinatalist project, where
Yeah.
all of the sex in Sade, as Paglia points out, is explicitly antinatalist, anti-birth, anti-reproduction. This is the whole kind of satanic inversion project that he's doing, and he loves abortion, he loves anal sex. So depicting in such stark terms and celebrating antinatalism to this degree exposes the kind of underlying violence and filth of what liberals try to paper over as they try to dance their way around human biology and pretend in more and more extreme ways that a fetus is not a person, or that abortion does not kill anyone.
That it
Um,
doesn't have side effects for the woman either.
yeah, yeah. Or
Liberating.
that gay sex doesn't have side effects, or, you know, basically anything. Their utopian vision is, you know, everything is medicalized in this very healthful, integrated way. But Sade shows the reality of everything that they're doing.
Yeah, and it's also the cognitive dissonance of, these people who are so dead set on this kind of social progress narrative that like we have to liberate the oppressed, we have to stand up for the underdog, when in reality this anti-natalist narrative is extremely elitist and disconnected from the realities of the working class, of the oppressed. Like like people don't seem to see or are determined not to see that there's a elitist kind of bent.
Oh yes, yeah, and Sade is explicitly aristocratic, even with his, you know, leftist revolution sympathies. Like everything depicted in the books is aristocratic, and everyone below his social class is just a tool, a sexual tool to be used, an animal. Um, what else about Sade? Oh, I also, when I read Justine and Juliet,
Mhm.
some of my favorite books are the massive popular 80s epic romance novels like Scruples, Judith Gould's Sins, um, Shirley Conran's Lace, that are all about these like Trumpian narratives of a woman rising from the bottom uh, to the top of like a magazine empire where she rules everyone and lives in
Mhm.
aristocratic high fashion, and it's peppered through with, you know, pornographic sex all the way. And I feel like Juliet is the precursor of all of these books, these decadent Trumpian soap opera books of the 80s. I feel like Juliet shows the spiritual reality of those books.
So then what do you think about Pasolini's version, Salo?
Oh, it's one of my favorite movies ever. It's just
Yeah.
totally misunderstood the way that critics try to justify it. Like you look at the Criterion packaging, and the extras on this, and every single thing is telling you that it's okay to watch this because it's about how Nazis are bad
Yeah.
and fascists are bad. And that's a total lie. That is not why someone undertakes a project such as that, the most extreme movie ever made, which basically resulted in his death, um, very poetically and appropriately. It's sadistic, perverted, artistic Sadian pornography. The way that utopian liberals have to justify consumption of transgressive media by saying that it's a tool of instruction, so that you know that Nazis are bad, and you can't forget history. History will repeat itself if we do.
Yeah.
Yeah, all that garbage. It's just such a lie. It's such a lie. But it's,
Yeah.
um,
You really have to reach to pull that out of there. But I mean,
but
I've
that's
read
what
some
they've
of
done.
the,
That's how they've
yeah.
justified the existence of that movie, for 40 years.
Yeah. And like I've read a lot of the Marxist readings, but in reality, like I think it's a strong refutation of Marx. If anything, it's a defense of the sacred, of the fact that there is a divine order, natural order to reality. Because if basically, if you banish God, if you banish any sense of the transcendent, then this is what you get. Like you get
Yeah, it's a vision of
electrification.
hell. It's a vision
Yeah.
of what happens with no spiritual direction. And it's also totally self-indulgent and intentionally erotic, which people have to skirt around. But I remember back in the day when I would read reviews of Salo, and it was some
Mhm.
liberal critic, and they would do the kind of Marxist analysis where they're like, oh, the shit feast is making fun of American fast food. Like, decadent Americans and their low quality fast food. This kind of Marxist reading of stuff, like, that is so unimaginative and so lame. And that's why people hate art cinema, because they read things like that is just so plainly spiritually inaccurate and has nothing to do with the intense content that you're viewing.
Yeah, and I mean, this is the ultimate miscalculation of liberalism, that we can defend the dignity of the person without there being some tie to something transcendent, like goodwill alone, being having good intentions is enough. When in reality, like our good intentions don't stand the chance against the darkness of nature. Like you can be nice as much as you want, but at a certain point, like this impulse to use to um to instrumentalize the person is going to come back. We can't fight that off without some kind of higher force intervening.
Right. And this spiritual wasteland, this kind of hell that's depicted in Salo, everyone likes to think of themselves as so far off from this, but you can see this kind of behavior and these spiritually lost people uh right nearby, especially if you're gay, especially if you're a young gay man. You see other people your age totally surrendering to godless decadence, where they're getting barebacked, fisted, doing meth all the time. And a lot of guys that I knew, they ended up dead by meth or suicide by their early 30s because of that. And the what you
That's because
see,
society's not accepting enough.
oh yeah, it's not their fault. It's society didn't accept gayness enough. There's no element of personal responsibility or like the soul or anything. But also in prison, when you
Mm.
like, if you go to prison, you see hell like depicted. Like, this is as low as humans can go. um but yeah, the way that Salo is kept at a distance because the truth of it is too spicy for people, is really funny. And that Criterion package where it's just assuring you, yeah, you can watch this because it's about how Nazis are bad, it's really funny.
Yeah. So so yeah, I want to shift over to Huysmans and Houellebecq. So Paglia mentions Huysmans a lot in Sexual Personae. But also Welbeck in Submission is basically, I guess he's trying to be a modern version of Against Nature. He references
Mhm.
that amongst the other novels, but yeah. So how did you first get into Against Nature? Like, where did you first? How did you find it?
Well, back in early college, one of my gay friends recommended it, and then a few days later repealed his recommendation
Hmm.
because he found that the book was actually reactionary and conservative. So that immediately piqued my interest, and I read it. I've read it twice at this
Yeah.
point. The first time I read it was before my interest in perfumes. So I love the obsessive cataloging
Yes.
of all of his different interests. And there's of course the whole chapter on perfumes
Hmm.
where he makes himself sick with his little self-constructed perfume organ. Um, but this resonates so deeply with my life and my identity because I surround myself with this esoterica and encyclopedic kind of collections of things that don't really matter. And as the outside world has gotten worse and worse politically and culturally, I've retreated to this inner world more and more, much like Des Esseintes. Um, the way that it depicts all sides of this, such as like his descent into decadence and isolation, just keeps making him sicker and sicker until he's eventually forced to leave his country manor and go back to the city and possibly receive Christian enlightenment. Um, it's so like the message of it is so profoundly different from any other kind of decadent gay literature that I had read up until that point.
Yeah. I think I first found it through Picture of Dorian Gray because it was the yellow book that supposedly perverted Dorian.
Mm-hmm.
And after some research, I figured out what it was. But yeah, I mean, I also relate to it a lot because of, I guess, the obsession, the kind of obsessive tendencies, I guess we could say Aspergian tendencies that he had to just catalog and categorize all these obscure esoterica. Um, but when you look at the cultural context that Huysmans was in, it's like, you know, you see how secularism is kind of ravaging French culture at the end of the century and just leaves you with this, I don't know, this disillusion, this emptiness. But especially for people who are kind of born with the sensibility that, like, this isn't enough, like, there has to be something else. It's extremely relatable, I think, today. And I think that's where Welbeck, like, he's kind of picking up on the same sentiment that a lot of people are feeling. The I ended up reading the Durtal series, which starts with Labat, where he's like experimenting with Satanism and the Black Mass, and then eventually ends up in a Benedictine monastery and becomes an oblate. And like, my hangup is that these kinds of narratives, at least within like contemporary Catholic Church kind of culture, is not really given much space because I don't know. I think we forget what Paglia reminds us of, the pagan decadent tendencies of Catholicism. But again, that it's so beyond this neutral kind of myth that like Durtal is attracted first to Satanism and then eventually makes his way to Catholicism. And like it's the same kind of thread that de Sade was picking up on. He ended up on the opposite end, of course, but I don't know, like this narrative speaks so much to me, but it's not. I just don't see it much in the culture out there, besides with people like Paglia, you know.
Oh no, I mean you won't. I mean in the current barren gray media landscape, you won't see any narrative offering any kind of spiritual perspective
Yeah.
whatsoever.
In a
I mean, if you,
sentimental sense, like at least again within religious kind of American Christian kind of cultures, like you see the sentimental feel good kind of Jesus, but it's not the kind of
yeah,
Jesus
the
that
Jesus is just
has a
like
flesh, it has a
accept
body.
everyone, the
Yeah,
kind of Jesus that's
be a
just
good
giving
person.
things away and accepting everyone. And pointing out everyone's hypocrisy.
Yeah.
You might see that, but like, you pull back far beyond current media not representing Christian narratives. You can't even represent heterosexual love in current movies in any kind of traditional sense. It's all this highly politicized utopian engineering where women and men must be defying stereotypes and be the exact opposite of any kind of acknowledged gender essentialist reality. And their romance cannot have any sort of heat to it, any kind of natural sexual undercurrent. Like we're in, I say without exaggeration, the most puritanical anti-sex age that has ever existed.
Yeah.
And people, a lot of right wingers, a lot of conservatives operate under this delusion that we're actually in a hypersexualized
Yeah.
culture. But it's so compartmentalized and abstract. And the fear of human sexuality is deeper and more laden with crucible witch hunt type sentiments than
Yeah.
has ever been that has ever happened before in history.
Yeah,
And
no, it's all sterilized. Like even the people who are most libertine, because I don't know, when you look at the word sexuality, it implies that there's this tension, this dynamic, something's happening between these two opposing forces, when in reality, all the sex is sterile. There's no tension. It's all sedated.
I
Doesn't
do
point
see
to
it
anything greater, you know.
like, Palia's main thesis that in times of civilizational decline,
Yeah.
transgenderism and sadomasochism will flourish. That's what's happening. I see everything, the woke religion, 2010s liberalism, all of this is tied up as one big uh, operation of sublimated sadomasochistic sexuality and control. And it's mixed up with religion. The absence of religion and structure in people's lives is obviously why they flock to things like this, which offer uh, a pseudo-religious narrative of original sin, even because it's all based around the original sin of whiteness.
Yeah.
um but yeah, I do see it as this kind of sterile, medicalized, commodified, sadomasochistic rerouting of sexuality.
Yeah, and I also pick up on, as you said, this puritanical strain in the sense that like there's such an obsession with morality without the awareness that we as humans are by nature immoral. And sure, like we can strive towards moral ideals, but it's not, we don't bring ourselves there. Like there has to be some force external to us that makes it possible for us to be moral. And no one wants to acknowledge that we are sinners. We're all screwed up. Um, like if you sin, then you have to be eliminated, exterminated. You have to be canceled. Like
Well,
there's
the thing with
doesn't have
liberalism is
that.
that their religion offers no path to redemption at all. It's
Yeah.
entire like self-circulating, like recycled air nihilism and punishment. So it's much more like the world depicted by Sade
Yeah.
than anything else. Because yeah, the whole operation of canceling people, um, there is, as we've seen over and over again with everyone, no path to redemption
No.
at all. You can never atone enough. And people who are buying into the system and not rejecting the entire framework of modern liberalism, they think that they can claw their way back into the old world, the old normality and comfort that they once
Yeah.
felt. But no, this is specifically designed as an Ouroboros of punishment that never ends, and it's constantly shape shifting to keep people on their toes so that they don't know what objective reality is.
Yeah, and if you actually want to take up the cause of the oppressed, like there's no sense that you yourself have to actually live a life of moral discipline, of sacrifice, of poverty, spiritual poverty, that like to really advocate for people who are suffering and marginalized, like putting on this kind of performative show is not actually going to uplift the oppressed. Like you have to be implicated in that, like you have to be willing to take up the cross to suffer with them.
Hmm.
And
Hmm.
that's, I don't know, like the moral obsession just obscures the actual issues that are at hand. Like there are real social injustices, but I rarely see them actually getting addressed in a concrete way. It's all super abstract.
Because addressing a real social injustice involves personal risk,
Yeah.
and the whole structure of modern liberalism is dealing with dated paradigms that cultural paradigms that don't apply to our current situation. Like
Yeah.
everyone still believes we're in this kind of Gen X fantasy of like evangelical Christians having power, and
Mm.
the leftists being this countercultural force of truth and beauty. And that was a lie even as it was happening. Evangelical Christians never had power. It's a total lie.
Mhm.
um but like it's this false sense of being on the right side of morality that involves no personal risk, nothing. It's just all about social status. And every concession anyone has ever made to 2010s liberalism has been about social status. It has not been about um, justice or reparations
Yeah.
or any kind of moral duty. And they know, they know.
Yeah. So then what do you make of Houellebecq's incorporation of Huysmans into submission? Like, do you think, I don't know, is it fair to say that he is the kind of heir of Huysmans' legacy?
Um, yeah, submission, it feels like it happened a million years ago, even though it was 2015.
Mm.
And this was before Red Scare popularized Houellebecq with e-girls and like internet people.
Mhm.
And I knew about Houellebecq from John Waters, who had always said he was his favorite writer.
Interesting.
And ordering submission on release day felt like a really dangerous act at the time, because this was at the height of like Islamic terror and the liberal obsession with Islamophobia, which has since disappeared and been replaced by Black Lives Matter and transgenderism, all of this other stuff. Um, but at the time, it felt really naughty.
Mm.
And what he does there, his, in addition to the way he explicitly uses Huysmans for inspiration, he's also imitating Jean Raspail's Camp of the Saints
Mhm.
from the early 70s, which was about immigrant hordes overtaking France and ending Western civilization. And this book in the mid 2010s um, was being talked about a lot in hysterical terms by liberals, because the dangerous alt-right was popularizing it, like Steve Bannon,
Mhm.
and people like that were popularizing this old racist French book. And Submission is obviously imitating that, and he does a clever balancing act where, since he cynically submits to the Islamic takeover at the end, you can kind of make your arguments like, oh, this book isn't actually as racist and problematic as it was made out to be at the time. So he kind of gets to have it both ways. But if you read all of Houellebecq, you know that it's like the same essentially racist nationalist formula happening
Mhm.
throughout all of them. But you get a little comfort there, and so maybe he's being ambiguous with submission. I think he's the heir to Huysmans. I mean, he's the only like author of literary fiction that I see being talked about with any excitement at all these days. Like the cult he has about him is really remarkable at a time where literally no one reads.
Yeah. No, I mean, I definitely feel like the same way that Against Nature and the Durtal series resonates with me, I felt like Houellebecq did in a, more contemporary, relatable way. But I did find interesting the way that he attempted to like recover. At first, he tries to look at like the Catholic legacy of France, and he goes to the monastery. And I found funny when he like tried to smoke the cigarette in the room in the retreat room, but they had a the smoke detector, so that was failed. But then then comes Islam, and it's interesting because the whoever it was, the prime minister, whoever was taking over the government, like is talking about these principles from Catholic social teaching, like especially distributist kind of economic model, which is sensible, is I don't know if it's realistic, but but then at the same time, like I don't know, what if there were this kind of moderate version of Sharia law that was imposed in these European countries? Like the way he made it look didn't sound so bad to me. I don't know. I mean, I know he wasn't
Right.
going for that, but
Well, one of the funniest things in that book is the way that women submitting to like the nationalized Islam just happens in like one sentence. There's no,
yeah.
which like there's no like feminist battle against it, because especially at that time where the liberal dialogue around Islam was one of the first kind of red pilling things for me and for many people, because you would see the inherent hypocrisy and contradictions there, where liberal feminists who believed in abortion, total freedom for women to do anything without moral consequence, they were constantly and exclusively standing up for these the Muslims who don't allow women to drive, who do female genital mutilation,
Mhm.
but it didn't disturb them. Like that hypocrisy didn't disturb them. I remember like when the Charlie Hebdo shooting happened, my like liberal feminist roommate was talking about it, and she just used this chilling phrase, well, we shouldn't have stirred the ant pile. And that's what something that white liberal feminists say about whenever there's like an act of Islamic terror, is that the Westerners shouldn't have stirred the ant pile. But everyone uh, on both right and left kind of admires Islam right now for depicting a world where feminists don't get their way. I think I think like conservatives from 2014 2015 who had this intense animosity towards Islam, they eventually found that women were the bigger problem because women enacted all the worst excesses of late 2010s liberalism. They're
Mhm.
foremost in the battle for transgenderism and unfettered immigration and all of this. And now, women are being white women are being demonized, and it's coming to eat them too. Um, it just feels like a totally different cultural moment right now. But then everything in
Yeah.
2015, everything was about Islam. That was
Yeah.
when the ISIS
Mhm.
beheading videos would just be like on your feed.
Yeah.
Like,
But like I feel like in both the mainstream left and right, like they're totally evading what is happening in these kinds of phenomena of Islamic radicalism. That it's not, I don't know, at least on the left, when they construct this as a reaction to Islamophobia and intolerance, like no, like this is a reaction to radical decadent Western secularism. This is why so many young Arab men are drawn to it. And sure, like terrorism's not a viable solution, but they see something very real in Islam. They see um this radical affirmation of the divinity of God. And like this is also what interests me but troubles me about Houellebecq, is that I think the concept of submission in Islam can be very alluring. It is decadent in itself. But within Christianity, like the phenomenon of the incarnation, that the divine becomes a human, suffers like a human, it requires this kind of overstepping of this, I don't know, these human ways of thinking. Like it's the humility that's required to accept it is, it throws you off because it's too simple.
mhm.
And I wonder, I don't know, like I don't know enough about Welbeck as a person, but like you see, at least he sympathizes with the medieval legacy, but doesn't find himself to be able to accept the possibility that this could be real, like that there could be a divine entity that is benevolent, that is that can shape our culture, that is real.
Yeah, he feels like it's LARPing. Like
Yeah.
the end of Submission, when he abandons his attempts to be Catholic, that's very predictive of the current kind of Catholic fervor on Twitter that's escalated in the last 2 years.
Mhm.
Um, but yeah, I feel like he just sees it as LARPing, and um, can't fully surrender himself to it, can't fully believe it. The shocking and enlightening thing about Houellebecq when I first encountered him, the first one I read was Elementary Particles, which I still think is the best,
Mhm.
um, was I had never seen uh, the 60s and the counterculture and the sexual revolution depicted negatively.
Yeah.
Everything that I had read up to that point depicted the 60s as wonderful. And now I find myself defending the 60s a lot because I feel like people do this overly simplistic kind of right-wing trad moralism where they blame everything in the
Mhm.
60s. But I'm actually a very 60s kind of person myself, and everything I do comes from a true 60s hippie kind of libertarian um, psychedelic intellectualism.
Yeah.
But with Elementary Particles in like 2010, like the big reveal when you read that book and you're like, oh, this is like an acclaimed work of literary fiction, and you find it's actually truly reactionary right wing and full of, like, you think there's going to be some big reveal, like a lesson learned. No, it's like I had never read anything like that up to that point. um Depicting the sexual excesses of his like neglectful hippie parents and everything.
Yeah. Yeah. So then before we wrap up, what do you think is the path forward? Like, how do we not lose hope in the midst of this kind of chaotic cultural moment?
I think people should be normal. I think they should be less online. I think that they should read fiction. uh I think that they should look to um abandoned and censored and canceled works of the past for clues to the path forward.
Mhm.
um Before you progress in any other way, you must completely reject the framework of modern 2010s Democrat liberalism. And in this sort of post-left, dirtbag left scene, these people are constantly they experience a little animosity and rejection and a little light red pilling for the first time, and they're immediately looking for paths back to the comforting arms of the Democrat Party
Mhm.
and ways to still consider themselves one of the good guys, one of the liberals that they've always known that they are. And that's not going to happen until you reject the entire framework, demonstrate some bravery in what you do. Um, Anonymity is a plague, and I don't think that real progress can be made with people being ashamed of what they believe in. You have
Mhm.
to assume risk. You have to publicly assume risk for what you say and find a way to say it. um
Yeah.
I think for straight
Mhm.
people, marriage is the path. Marriage and having children is the obvious path forward. Since we've had several successive generations of spoiled liberal antinatalist white people who wait until their mid 40s to
Yeah.
realize they want to have children. So I think getting married and having children is a good thing for straight people. For gays, I think that you need to concentrate on reproducing through enlightening art that
Mhm.
does something positive for the world. And since liberals have totally rejected all art and all history in favor of their nihilistic, self-replicating communist death cult, it's all ours now. So
Yeah.
liberals don't own art.
Yeah. I mean, for me, I feel like the most simple thing to do is like look in the mirror and recognize, especially people who are very caught up with social issues and harp on, whatever cause du jour. Like, if you can recognize yourself implicated in the problems of the world, that like you are a problem, you're screwed up, you're sinful, just like everyone else. I think if we can just accept that fact and like just begin from there, as you said, we can kind of return to some sense of normalcy because, yeah, like there are real issues that need to be addressed. People are suffering, but how do we address that? It's not through a performance, it's accepting the reality of who I am, accepting the reality of what it means to be human. And then from there, I think things might be clearer. But anyway, so Jack, is there anything you want to plug before we go?
So we're on Patreon. It's patreon.com/perfume nationalist. We alternate paywalled and free episodes. There are plenty of free episodes up on Apple and Libsyn and Spotify to dip into, but you don't get the full story as intended from start to finish unless you subscribe to the Patreon. I'll also, by sheer coincidence, next week we're on my show, we're going to be talking about Camp of the Saints, Submission, and the Sally Field movie Not Without My Daughter.
Awesome.
And then in March, I will be teaching a class for Renegade University on Houellebecq.
Cool.
So
Awesome.
a lot going on in the Houellebecq world.
Yes. And the new book is the English translation is coming out in May, I think. That's what I heard.
Nice.
Yeah. So, well, Jack, thanks for coming on. This was
Yeah,
fun.
thanks for having me. It was a pleasure.
So